Miss Craig was a beautiful, intelligent young woman who loved learning since she was young, but unfortunately for her mother died when she was young, and she was raised harshly by her stepmother, who was keen to make her do all the household chores that were exhausting for a young girl. But despite that, Miss Craig was keen. She loved reading and enjoyed the stories and novels that taught her a lot about the world, and taught her that life was bigger than her father's house and the ferocity of his wife, and that the future was in front of her so she could do whatever she wanted with it. When Miss Craig grew up, she tried a lot to rebel against her stepmother, but she always failed, and her stepmother was able to win over her, especially since she knew how to completely control her husband and convince him that his daughter was the cause of all the problems that occurred in the family, and that she was a rebel who had to be deterred. Unfortunately, he fell ill. Miss Craig's father died, and within several months, his wife decided to expel Miss Craig from the house. When Miss Craig tried to defend herself for her right to her father's house, his wife told her that he had decided to register the house in her name because he loved her more. Her stepmother forced her to leave the house and only allowed her to carry her clothes. Miss Craig went to the house of one of her relatives, but unfortunately his financial condition was not good, so Miss Craig decided to start looking for work immediately. She was good at dealing with children, loved reading, and had a lot of patience, which is why her relative suggested to her that she work as a nanny for the children, as this work would provide her with a good salary that would help her buy everything she needed, in addition to providing her with a house in which she could live. As most of the families who were requesting a nanny at that time wanted the nanny must be present throughout the day, and for this reason a special room is provided for the nanny to live in the same family home. Miss Craig was able to get a job as a nanny for the children in the home of a politician, and that family provided her with a special room to live in during non-work hours. The work was very hard, but Miss Craig was happy and felt that she was doing something she loved and helping others. But unfortunately, within several months, the family decided to travel, and for this reason, Miss Craig's services were dispensed with. Miss Craig then began looking for work again. Unfortunately, she was unable to find any work anywhere near London, but she noticed that there were many families requesting nannies in the countryside area. Miss Craig thought, why not? And she actually contacted one of the families who seemed to be a good family. They only had one little girl. Miss Craig decided to travel to meet the family. The house was in a remote rural area, a large house surrounded by fields in every direction. Miss Craig immediately felt comfortable with that little family, the Banker family. When she looked at the little girl, Gigi, she immediately felt that she was a special child, and that is why she agreed to work and returned again to her relative's house to carry her bags and settle in the home of the Banker family and their little daughter, Gigi. The Banker family had no luck in choosing the nannies. The family had been robbed more than once by the nannies they chose for Gigi, so it was necessary for the choice to be wise this time. Mrs. Banker did not want to repeat the same bad experiences that she had previously gone through. At the same time, she wanted to choose a suitable nanny who has sufficient education and patience to help little Gigi in the early stages of her education, and that nanny must be aware of the principles of decency and tactful behavior in order to help Gigi to behave better. Despite all these concerns and requirements, Mrs. Banker felt very comfortable with Miss Craig and decided to hire her immediately. When Miss Craig traveled to London to bring her belongings, Mrs. Banker personally made sure to arrange everything in order to prepare the house to receive Miss Craig, and she took care to arrange Miss Craig's room so that she would feel comfortable and reassured at home. After several days, Miss Craig arrived at the Bunker family home and was greeted by Mrs. Bunker and little Gigi. Miss Craig knew from the first day that Mr. Bunker was often traveling due to his work, and that is why she would spend most of her time with Gigi and her mother. Mrs. Bunker welcomed Miss Craig and told her that her work would begin the next day. As for today, she could spend it with her and Gigi to get to know them better and also enjoy the delicious dinner that Kate had prepared in honor of Miss Craig. Miss Craig spent the time, and it was really interesting and enjoyable. When bedtime approached, Mrs. Bunker asked her to accompany her to show her her room. Miss Craig looked for her bags, and Mrs. Bunker told her that the bags were already in her room, just waiting for her to take out her clothes and arrange them in the way you love. Mrs. Bunker, followed by Miss Craig, went up to the room, and here Mrs. Bunker began to tell Miss Craig to consider herself at home and not to feel any embarrassment in asking for anything if she needed it. She also told her about her day off and about some of the activities that she could do on this day, such as going to the market in the town next to them or perhaps going to the library next to the church. Mrs. Bunker wished Miss Craig a good night and left her to arrange her things. Miss Craig began arranging her things and fell asleep that night feeling happy. The next day, she began actual work with little Gigi, who was beautiful, intelligent, obedient, and quick to learn, and all of these qualities made Miss Craig love her as if she were her own daughter. Miss Craig spent her entire day next to Gigi, which helps her learn and teaches her how to behave and plays with her as well. And in the evening, she goes to her room to read and rest after a long day of work. Despite the effort that Miss Craig was making, she was happy and stable for the first time in a long time. And one rainy day, the little girl Gigi was suffering from a fever, and her temperature was frighteningly high. And she had all the symptoms that indicate that she was suffering from appendicitis. At that time, her mother, Mrs. Banker, did not know what to do, especially since Gigi's father was traveling for a week and took the car with him. At that time, Mrs. Banker was thinking about how she could get the family's doctor to examine Gigi. She tried to give Gigi drinks and natural herbs to relieve the pain, but unfortunately, the recipes and herbs did not do anything for her, and her temperature was rising to the point that Gigi began to hallucinate words that were incomprehensible. At that time, Mrs. Banker felt that she had to act quickly. She thought quickly and remembered that on a farm next to them, there was a doctor from Liverpool who was visiting a relative. So she felt that this was the best solution. She would bring this doctor temporarily until she reached the family doctor, and the doctor would certainly not mind coming, especially since he would take money. There was no one in the house except Mrs. Bunker and Gigi, and with them was Kate the cook, who was old and walked with difficulty and only knew how to do her work, and finally, Miss Craig. And so it was not difficult for Mrs. Bunker to decide who would go and get the doctor from the neighbor's farm. Mrs. Bunker called Miss Craig and told her that she needs to prepare herself to go and get the doctor. Miss Craig was worried at first and told Mrs. Bunker that she did not know the way to the neighbor's farm. Mrs. Bunker reassured her and described the road to her and told her that the distance was not long, only about 4 miles. All she has to do is walk on the swamp road for 2 miles, and then she will reach a crossroads with a cross on it called the Redmond Cross, and then she will turn north and walk on the bumpy road. At the end of the road, she will find the Snowbar farm and then along the neighbor's farm down in the valley. Miss Craig was nervous and worried about the request and about the way she was going to take, especially since the moon was slightly bright that night and the sky was full of clouds and it was raining. But she had no solution except that she agreed and went to get the doctor from the neighbor's farm. Then Mrs. Bunker said to Miss Craig, "There is nothing to be afraid of or to worry about, but you can take the dog with you." Miss Craig replied and told her that she would take it. Mrs. Bunker's last request to Miss Craig was that she should bring the Pope with her so that he could bless the house and Gigi. Miss Craig went downstairs to get her boots that she had been drying next to the fireplace, and she sat down to put them on and go out. Kate the cook looked at her with pity and said to her, "How could Mrs. Bunker send you down this road on a night like this, especially after what happened to the old maid?" Kate continued her words and said to her, "Also, the doctor will not do anything to Gigi if you bring him. All children get sick from time to time, and he will say that she should rest in bed, and she is already in bed." Miss Craig responded to Kate while she was trying to reassure herself and said to her, "I don't think there is anything to be afraid of, so don't worry." At that time, she was tying the strap on her boots, so she continued her words while looking at Kate and saying, "Unless you believe in ghosts." Kate replied to her and said to her, "I don't know if there are ghosts or not, but I certainly don't like to sleep in the bed. The blanket is too short, so I can cover head with it if I get scared at night. But you don't have to be afraid, because the sounds of ghosts are scarier than their bites." And Kate laughed at what she said to Miss Craig, and because of what Kate said, Miss Craig forgot to take the dog and moved while trying to calm herself down and not thinking about anything that Kate the cook said. But she couldn't stop thinking about Kate's words about ghosts barking. She felt that she was not comfortable. Miss Craig used to worry and get nervous easily, especially since her work in remote places in the countryside made her hear many stories about ghosts. But she did not believe that they were real, and she always thought it was only stories. It was their imagination. She tried to be calmer, and so she can move without fear. Miss Craig took the track described by Mrs. Bunker. She walked 2 miles to the crossroads and arrived at Redmond Cross. When she read the name, she felt a shiver throughout her body, and she remembered the old incident that she had read about, a terrifying murder that had taken place in that place. She didn't remember the exact details, but she remembered that Redmond's name was linked to a heinous crime. Miss Craig saw the convent a few steps away from her place, and she actually went to get the Pope as Mrs. Bunker had asked her. But when the Pope knew that she is the nanny sick, would not go with her, and after waiting more than 10 minutes at the convent door and many attempts by Miss Craig to call him out, she understood that he was not going to go. With her, she continued on her way alone, forced. Miss Craig was upset about what happened and that she was late, and he didn't come with her, but there was nothing to do except moving, and while she was walking, it started to rain lightly. The rain was working like sprinklers, but unfortunately it caused the tracks of cars and feet on the road to go away, and that's why Miss Craig was worried, but she continued on her way normally. Finally, Miss Craig arrived at the neighbor's farm, and they allowed her to enter. There, she met Mrs. Tippett, who was kind to Miss Craig and offered to come in and also gave her a cup of warm milk and a piece of cake. But unfortunately, Miss Craig did not see the doctor and knew that he had returned to Liverpool yesterday. Miss Craig finished the milk and cake and excused herself. She decided to go back. Mrs. Tippett insisted that her son take Miss Craig to the crossroads. Despite Miss Craig's refusal, Mrs. Tippett did not agree and told her son to go with Miss Craig. Her son was a quiet young man, but his mere presence made Miss Craig feel safe. At the crossroads, Mrs. Tippett's son went back to the farm. Miss Craig continued on her way to go home. Miss Craig suddenly felt that the world had become quiet and that the night had become darker than before. Her thoughts returned once again when she was distracted by the words of the cook Kate about ghosts barking. Suddenly, she began to hear the sound of footsteps coming from behind her onto the road. She tried to ignore this sound, but after a while, she was sure there was someone behind her. Miss Craig tried to look calmly. She tried to look. Then she found a man walking in the road, a man who looked strange, as if he was from outside the place. When she looked at his clothes, she saw that he was a priest. The first time he looked at her, he raised his hat to her as a greeting and said, "I think we are walking in the same direction." He continued his words while saying to her, "If you would allow me to walk with you." Miss Craig responded to him, thanking him and saying, "This night is strange." She continued saying, "Especially with all the stories we hear about ghosts and spirits from the countryside. I stopped being afraid." The priest responded to her and said to her, "I can understand your stress, especially on moonless nights like today. I also had the same feeling when I was working and had to walk alone in the swamp road." He continued his words while laughing and saying to Miss Craig, "The road is difficult to walk in, even during the day." Miss Craig asked him, "I mean, you didn't see anything to fear. I mean, something non-material." The priest replied to her and said to her, "I can't say that I really saw anything, but after 11 years of experience, something happened to me that was a turning point for me." Miss Craig looked at him intently, as if she was asking him to tell her more. So he began to speak and said, "You are curious to know. If I were from you, I would feel the same way." And he began to tell her what happened. 1 year ago, at the end of September, I was in the Weston Dale area. I was in the house of an old woman who was dying. I left her house and returned to the monastery. There I knew that one of my friends from the parish had suddenly fallen ill and was tired. It was 7 o'clock at that time. I went out on the road and there was a farmer walking on the same road. He saw me and I greeted him and I moved. I reached the swamp road and the sunset was gloomy, unlike the sunset of the day before. The sky was clear and the clouds were small and pink in color, as if they were scattered petals from a whole rose. But this day, everything was different. The sky was all very pale, except for one corner to the west. There was a very small crack. In this crack was the last yellow ray of the sun. Everything was depressing. That day I was tired and felt that my legs were aching from walking, and I began to get lost in the strange contrast between the sky yesterday and today. Even the weather was different from yesterday. After it was good and refreshing, it became gloomy and sad, as if every day of autumn and winter diminished on this day. The general atmosphere made me feel depressed and afraid. I didn't know why I felt afraid. I was trying to focus on the fields on the swamp road and on the road and the grass on the ground. The only sound I heard during all this time was the sound of the wild chickens that were screaming as if they were telling me to come back, come back, come back. At that time, my mind was dominated by a feeling of fear in particular. At that time, the world began to darken and became colder. I closed the buttons of my coat and began trying to think and occupy my mind with different thoughts. I thought about next Sunday's sermon, and I was thinking of leaving the sermon on the prophet Job, especially since the story of the prophet Job contains many sermons about patience. It will be excellent, especially for people who lose their livestock and crops, or for families who are dispersed. I then began to remember the time when I was a farmer and water flooded my land and I lost everything. How can a person lose everything he owns in an instant? And I began to repeat verses from the Bible to myself and stopped at the 12th verse. Then the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is power in your hand." I looked in front of me, and the valleys were so large and wide that I felt that I was looking into an endless ocean. The night was covering everything, and I started thinking about the sermons and speeches I had heard before. I was lost in the old idea that this life is a chessboard, and that God and Satan are the players, and all humans are the pawns. At that time, I had arrived at this place where we are now, and it was quite calm. At that time, a man came quickly from the side of the road and said, "Which way are you going, Governor?" I knew from the way he spoke that he was a stranger to the place, but it is normal every year at the same time many people from the south like to come to the cornfields to watch and spend time. At that time, I told him my way, and he told me to go together. The world was so dark that I did not see this man's face. I only saw a small part, but the part I saw was rough and had a harsh appearance. Then he started to feel as if he was in pain and told me that he had been walking on the road since the morning and had not eaten anything since breakfast time, and said that he had not taken anything from his work except the housing money only. And then he started to walk away. A little while from me, he took out a large knife and began to cut a stick of ash that he had with him while he was focused on what he was doing. The priest was silent for a while and asked Miss Craig, "Is this the light of your house?" Then continued talking. "We are certain that it is closer than expected, but there is still time for me to complete the story to you. My house is also close, and I don't want you to be afraid anymore while you are walking in the swamp road." Miss Craig shook her head, certain that she wanted to hear the rest of the story. He said, "The strange man asked me what time it was. I looked at my watch. It was 5 minutes to 9, and at that time I looked at his face while saying, I found him clenching his teeth strangely, and his teeth were shining. I looked at his eyes, were shining too. His eyes shone and let me know what he was going to do. In less than 1 second, without any warning or a single word, I no longer felt anything. All I felt was as if lightning was running down my spine, and I heard a faint sound of a pile of ash breaking under me, and then a crackling sound, as if it was the sound of a distant river flowing. I slept on my back for a minute, and at that time I felt completely happy as I saw the lights of the stars in the sky, and they began to increase and increase until the whole sky was filled with as if I was in heaven, and at that time I knew that I could not die in a way that was not less painful than that. Miss Craig heard the last sentence the priest said and looked at him in shock, but she did not stop. She looked around and discovered that she was completely alone in the path of the swamp. She ran towards the house, her teeth chattering together, and immediately entered the house. And as soon as she entered the clock that was hanging in the middle of the hall, it chimed. It was exactly 9 o'clock. Miss Craig ran into the kitchen and found Kate still awake. Miss Craig asked her about Gigi and learned from her that she was feeling better, and her temperature had gone down, and she no longer needed a doctor. Miss Craig's face was yellow, and she was clearly stressed, which made Kate the cook ask her what happened to her and why she looked like that. Miss Craig was hesitant at first to tell what happened because she knew it would be difficult for anyone to believe her. She preferred not to say anything. She went to Gigi's room and reassured that she was fine. She told Mrs. Bunker that the doctor had traveled and returned to Liverpool again. Then she asked Mrs. Bunker to go. She went to her room. She sat on her bed. She remained in her place, unable to move, and did not know how to believe what had happened to her. After a while, she got up from the bed and went towards the library. Miss Craig was keeping all the books and newspapers that she had in a small library. Then, in that library, she started looking for something, and after a while she took out a newspaper and started flipping through it until she came across a piece of news in the newspaper that talked about the priest who was found murdered on the swamp road after the Red Man Crossroad, and the killing was by slaughter, and it was not known until now who is the killer. There was a picture with the news. When Miss Craig looked at the picture, she saw the same priest who was walking with her until she reached the house. As soon as the light rose again in the morning, she gathered all her clothes and things and decided to leave work and the whole countryside, and she returns again to the city and does not think about what happened to her at all.